Well, just before we have our reading of 2 Kings chapter 1, we might be thinking this morning, well, what happens in 1 Kings? It feels like we're jumping in the story halfway through, and we kind of are this morning as we start 2 Kings. So a bit of a recap for us to help us see what the story's been so far as we get to 2 Kings chapter 1. You see, God's people, the people of Israel, who are followed right the way through the Old Testament, well, they end up in God's promised land, a land that God wanted to give them, that had everything they needed, and God wanted his people to be in his place under his rule and his word, listening to him and worshipping him as their God. And at that point, when they come into the land, the people of Israel exist as 12 tribes. And it's actually under King David, to cut a long story short, that those 12 tribes are then unified into one kingdom. And it's King David's son, Solomon, that actually starts the book of 1 Kings. And things look like they're going really well for the people of Israel under Solomon. But actually towards the end and after Solomon, that's when things begin to fall apart for the people of Israel. In 1 Kings, we find that that kingdom that was once unified together is now divided. 10 tribes now go and form the northern kingdom called Israel, and 2 tribes go and form the southern kingdom called Judah. And 1 Kings really follows the stories of how kings of both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, well, what their attitude was to God's word. And most of the time it looks like these kings reject God's word, and instead of worshipping God, actually instead they worship other gods instead. And so in 1 Kings, God sends his word, his prophet Elijah, one of the main characters, and God is gracious enough to speak his word to them and to warn his people about what they're doing. But in 1 Kings, we could almost say that it's summed up by maybe one of the main kings in the book. We are introduced to King Ahab in 1 Kings, who rules over the northern kingdom. And it says in chapter 16 of 1 Kings that he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He rejects God's word. And in fact, right at the end of 1 Kings, just before we start 2 Kings, we're introduced to King Ahab's son, Ahaziah. And we see that he follows in the exact same pattern as his father. And so the question really is, as we move over now into 2 Kings, is, well, are God's people ever going to listen to God's word? And if not, what is God going to do? So that's hopefully a helpful recap in where the story has been now at 2 Kings.